Psychoanalysis and Ethnology. We are moving too fast, acting as if Oedipus were already installed within the savage territorial machine. However, as Nietzsche says with regard to bad conscience, such a plant does not grow on that kind of terrain. This is explained by the fact that the necessary conditions for Oedipus as a familial complex, existing in the framework of the familialism suited to psychiatry and psychoanalysis, are obviously not present. Primitive families constitute a praxis, a politics, a strategy of alliances and filiations. Formally, they are the driving elements of social reproduction. They have nothing to do with an expressive microcosm. In these families, the father, the mother, and the sister always also function as something other than father, mother, or sister. And in addition to the father, the mother, etc., there is the affine, who constitutes the active, concrete reality and makes the relations between families coextensive with the social field. It would not even be exact to say that the family determinations burst apart at every corner of this field and remain attached to strictly social determinations, since both kinds of determinations form one and the same component in the territorial machine. Since familial reproduction is not yet a simple means, or a material at the service of a social reproduction of another nature, there is no possibility of reducing, rabattre sur, social reproduction to familial reproduction. Nor is it possible to establish one-to-one relations between the two that would confer on any familial complex, whatever an expressive value and an apparent autonomous form. On the contrary, it is evident that the individual in the family, however young, directly invests a social, historical, economic, and political field that is not reducible to any mental structure or affective constellation. That is why, when one considers pathological cases and processes of cure in primitive societies, it seems to us entirely insufficient to compare them with psychoanalytic procedure by relating them to criteria borrowed from the latter. For example, a familial complex, even if it differs from our own, or cultural material, des contenus culturels, even if it is brought into relation with an ethnic unconscious, as seen in attempted parallelisms between the psychoanalytic cure and the shamanistic cure. Deleuze, Lévi-Strauss. Our definition of schizoanalysis focused on two aspects: the destruction of the expressive pseudo-forms of the unconscious, and the discovery of desire's unconscious investments of the social field. It is from this point of view that we must consider many primitive cures. They are schizoanalysis in action. Victor Turner gives a remarkable example of such a cure among the Ndembu. The example is the more striking, to our perverted eyes, for the fact that, at first glance, everything appears edible. Effeminate, insufferable, vain, failing at everything he tries, the sick K is preyed upon by the ghost of his maternal grandfather, who cruelly reproaches him. Although the Ndembu are matrilineal and must live with their maternal kin, K has stayed an exceptionally long time in the matrilineage of his father, whose favourite he was, and has entered into marriage with paternal cousins. But with the death of his father he is driven away, and returns to the maternal village. There his house expresses his situation well, being wedged between two sectors, the houses of the members of the paternal group and those belonging to his own matrilineage. How does the divination, responsible for indicating the cause of the illness, proceed, and the medical cure responsible for treating it? The teeth are the cause, the top two incisors of the ancestor hunter, contained in a sacred pouch, but which can escape from the pouch and penetrate the body of the sick man. In order to diagnose and ward off the effects of the incisor, the soothsayer and the medicine man launch into a social analysis concerning the territory and its environs, the chieftainship and its sub-chieftainships, the lineages and their segments, the alliances and the filiations. They constantly bring to light desire in its relations with political and economic units, the very point on which, moreover, the witnesses try to mislead them. Divination becomes a form of social analysis in the course of which hidden struggles between individuals and factions are brought to light, in such a way that they can be treated by traditional ritual methods, the vague nature of mystical beliefs allowing them to be manipulated in relation to a great number of social situations. It seems that the pathological incisor is indeed mainly that of the maternal grandfather. But the latter was a great chief. His successor, the real chief, had had to relinquish the throne for fear of being bewitched, and his would-be heir, intelligent and ambitious, does not exercise the power. The actual chief is not the real chief. As for the sick K, he has not been able to assume the role of mediator that could have made him a candidate for chief. Everything becomes complicated because of the colonizer-colonized relations. The English have not recognized the chieftainship. The impoverished village is falling into decrepitude. The two sectors of the village result from a fusion of two groups that have fled the English. The elders bemoan the current decadence. The medicine man does not organize a sociodrama, but a veritable group analysis centering on the sick individual, giving him potions, attaching horns to his body for drawing up the incisor, making the drums beat. The medicine man proceeds with the ceremony interrupted by halts and fresh departures, flows of all sorts, flows of words and breaks. The members of the village come to talk. The sick subject talks. The ghost is invoked. The medicine man explains. Everything recommences. Drums, chants, trances. It is not only a question of discovering the pre-conscious investments of a social field by interests, but, more profoundly, its unconscious investments by desire, such as they pass by way of the sick person's marriages, his position in the village, and all the positions of a chief lived in intensity within the group. We said that the point of departure seemed Oedipal. It was only the point of departure for us, conditioned to say Oedipus every time someone speaks to us of father, mother, grandfather. In fact, the Ndembu analysis was never Oedipal. It was directly plugged into social organization and disorganization. Sexuality itself, through the women and the marriages, was just such an investment of desire. The parents played the role of stimuli in it, and not the role of group organizers, or disorganizers, the role held by the chief and his personages. Rather than everything being reduced to the name of the father, or that of the maternal grandfather, the latter opened onto all the names of history. Instead of everything being projected onto a grotesque hiatus of castration, everything was scattered in the thousand breaks-flows of the chieftainships, the lineages, the relations of colonization. The whole interplay of races, clans, alliances, and filiations, this entire historical and collective drift. Exactly the opposite of the Oedipal analysis, when it stubbornly crushes the content of a delirium, when it stuffs it with all its might into the symbolic void of the father. Or rather, if it is true that the analysis doesn't even begin as Oedipal, except to our way of seeing, doesn't it become Oedipal nevertheless, in a certain way? And in what way? Yes, it becomes Oedipal in part, under the effect of colonization. The colonizer, for example, abolishes the chieftainship, or uses it to further his own ends, and he uses many other things besides. The chieftainship is only a beginning. The colonizer says, your father is your father and nothing else, or your maternal grandfather. Don't mistake them for chiefs. You can go have yourself triangulated in your corner and place your house between those of your paternal and maternal kin. Your family is your family and nothing else. Sexual reproduction no longer passes through those points, although we rightly need your family to furnish a material that will be subjected to a new order of reproduction. Yes, then, an edible framework is outlined for the dispossessed primitives, a shantytown Oedipus. We have seen, however, that the colonized remained a typical example of resistance to Oedipus. In fact, that's where the Oedipal structure does not manage to close itself, and where the terms of the structure remain stuck to the agents of oppressive social reproduction, either in a struggle or in a complicity. The white man, the missionary, the tax collector, the exporter of goods, the person with standing in the village who becomes the agent of the administration, the elders who curse the white man, the young people who enter into a political struggle, etc. Both are true. The colonized resists Oedipalization, and Oedipalization tends to close around him again. To the degree that there is Oedipalization, it is due to colonization, and it is necessary to add Oedipalization to all the methods that Jaulin was able to describe in La Paix Blanche. The condition of the colonized can lead to a reduction in the humanization of the universe, so that any solution that is sought will be a solution on the scale of the individual and the restricted family, with, by way of consequence, an extreme anarchy or disorder at the level of the collective, an anarchy whose victim will always be the individual, with the exception of those who occupy the key positions in such a system, namely the colonizers, who, during this same period when the colonized reduced the universe, will tend to extend it. Oedipus is something like euthanasia within ethnocide. The more social reproduction escapes the members of the group, in nature and in extension, the more it falls back on them, or reduces them to a restricted and neuroticized familial reproduction, whose agent is Oedipus. After all, how are we to understand those who claim to have discovered an Indian Oedipus or an African Oedipus? They are the first to admit that they re-encounter none of the mechanisms or attitudes that constitute our own Oedipus, our own presumed Oedipus. No matter. They say that the structure is there, although it has no existence whatever that is accessible to clinical practice. Or that the problem, the point of departure, is indeed Oedipal, although the developments and the solutions are completely different from ours. Parin, Ortigues. They say that there is no end to the existence of this Oedipus, when in fact it does not even have, apart from colonization, the necessary conditions to begin to exist. If it is true that thought can be evaluated in terms of the degree of Oedipalization, then yes, whites think too much. The competence, the honesty, and the talent of these authors, psychoanalysts specializing in Africa, are beyond question. But the same applies to them as to certain psychotherapists here. It would seem that they don't know what they're doing. We have psychotherapists who sincerely believe they are engaged in progressive work when they apply new methods for triangulating the child. But watch out! A structural Oedipus, and this time it isn't imaginary. The same is true of the psychoanalysts in Africa who apply the yoke of a structural or problematic Oedipus in the service of their progressive intentions. There or here, it's the same thing. Oedipus is always colonization, pursued by other means. It is the interior colony, and we shall see that even here at home, where we Europeans are concerned, it is our intimate colonial education. How are we to understand the phrases with which M.C. and Edmond Ortigues conclude their book? Illness is considered as a sign of an election, of a special attention coming from supernatural powers, or as a sign of an aggression of a magical nature, an idea that is difficult to express in profane terms. Analytic psychotherapy can intervene only starting from the moment a demand can be formulated by the subject. Our entire research was therefore conditioned by the possibility of establishing a psychoanalytic domain. When a subject adhered fully to the traditional norms and had nothing to say in his own name, he allowed himself to be taken into the care of the traditional therapists and the familial group, or into that of the medical practice of medicines. At times, the fact that he wanted to speak to us about traditional treatments corresponded to a beginning of psychotherapy and became for him a means of situating himself personally in his own society. At other times, the analytic dialogue was able to unfold to a greater extent, and in this case the Oedipal problem tended to assume its diachronic dimension, causing the generation gap to appear. Why think that supernatural powers and magical aggressions constitute a myth that is inferior to Oedipus? On the contrary, is it not true that they move desire in the direction of more intense and more adequate investments of the social field, in its organization as well as its disorganizations? Mayor Fort at least showed Job's place beside Oedipus. And what entitles one to determine that the subject has nothing to say in his own name, so long as he adheres to traditional norms? Doesn't the Ndembu cure demonstrate just the opposite? Could it not be said that Oedipus is also a traditional norm, our own to be exact? How can one say that Oedipus makes us speak in our own name, when one also goes on to say that its resolution teaches us the incurable inadequacy of being and universal castration? And what is this demand that is invoked to justify Oedipus? It goes without saying, the subject demands and redemands daddy-mummy. But which subject? And in what state? Is that the means to situate oneself personally in one's own society? And which society? The neo-colonized society that is constructed for the subject, and that finally succeeds in what colonization was only able to outline, an effective reduction of the forces of desire to Oedipus, to a father's name, in the grotesque triangle. Let us return to the well-known and inexhaustible debate between culturalists and orthodox psychoanalysts. Is Oedipus universal? Is Oedipus the great paternal Catholic symbol, the meeting place of all the churches? The debate began between Malinowski and Jones. It continued between Kardiner and Fromm on one side and Roheim on the other. It is still pursued between certain ethnologists and certain disciples of Lacan, those who offered not only an Oedipalizing interpretation of Lacan's doctrine, but also an ethnographic extension to this interpretation. On the side of the universal, there are two poles. One, outdated it would seem, that makes of Oedipus an original affective constellation, and that constitutes an extreme position, arguing that Oedipus was a real event whose effects were transmitted through phylogenetic heredity. And the other pole, which makes Oedipus into a structure, a pole whose extreme position argues the possibility of discovering the structure in fantasy, in relation to biological prematuration and neoteny. Two very different conceptions of the limit, one as original matrix, the other as structural function. But in both these senses of the universal, we are invited to interpret, since the latent presence of Oedipus appears only through its patent absence, understood as an effect of psychic repression. Or, better still, since the structural constant is discovered only through its imaginary variations, attesting to the need for a symbolic foreclosure, the father as an empty position. Oedipus as universal recommences the old metaphysical operation that consists in interpreting negation as a deprivation, as a lack, the symbolic lack of the dead father, or the great signifier. Interpretation is our modern way of believing and of being pious. Already, Geza Roheim proposed organizing primitives into a series of variables converging toward the structural neotenic constant. It was he who said, in all seriousness, that the Oedipus complex was not to be found if it wasn't looked for, and that one wasn't looking if one hadn't had oneself analyzed. And that is why your daughter is mute, which is to say, the tribes, daughters of the ethnologist, do not say Oedipus, although it is Oedipus who makes them speak. Roheim added that it was ridiculous to think that the Freudian theory of censorship depended on the repressive regime in the empire of Franz Joseph. He did not seem to see that Franz Joseph was not a pertinent historical break, coupure, and that perhaps the oral, the written, or even the capitalist civilizations were such breaks with which the nature of social repression and the meaning and scope of psychic repression would vary. This story of psychic repression is quite complicated. Things would be simpler if the libido or the affect were repressed, in the most general sense of the word, suppressed, inhibited, or transformed, at the same time as the supposed Oedipal representation. But such is not the case. Most ethnologists have clearly noted the sexual nature of affects in the public symbols of primitive societies, and this nature remains integrally lived by the members of these societies, even though they have not been psychoanalyzed, and in spite of the displacement of the representation. As Leach says apropos of the sex-hair relationship, displaced phallic symbolism is very common, but the phallic origin of the symbolism is not repressed. Must it be said that primitives repress the representation and keep the affect intact? And would the contrary be true in our case, in the patriarchal organization where the representation would remain clear, but with the affect suppressed, inhibited, or transformed? No, in fact. Psychoanalysis tells us that we too repress the representation, and everything tells us that we too often keep the full sexuality of the affect. We know perfectly well what it is about, without having been psychoanalyzed. But what enables one to speak of an Oedipal representation that would be the object of repression? Is it because incest is prohibited? We always fall back on this pale rationale. Incest is desired because it is prohibited. The prohibition of incest would therefore imply an Oedipal representation, and it would be born of the repression of this representation and of the latter's return. Now the opposite is clearly the case. Not only does the Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, but it is not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. Adopting Malinowski's arguments, Reich added a profound remark. Desire is all the more Oedipal as the prohibitions are aimed not simply at incest, but at all other types of sexual relations, blocking the other paths. In a word, the repression of incest is not born of a repressed Oedipal representation any more than it provokes this repression. But, and this is something altogether different, the general social repression psychic repression system gives rise to an Oedipal image as a disfiguration of the repressed. The fact that this image in turn finally suffers a repression, that it comes to take the place of the repressed or of the thing that is effectively desired, insofar as sexual repression is directed at something other than incest. Such is the long history of our society. But the repressed is not first of all the Oedipal representations. What is repressed is desiring production. It is the part of this production that does not enter into social production or reproduction. It is what would introduce disorder and revolution to the socius, the non-coded flows of desire. The part that passes, on the contrary, from desiring production to social production forms a direct sexual investment of this social production, without any repression of a sexual nature, of the symbolism and the corresponding affects, and, above all, without any reference to an Oedipal representation that could be held to be originally repressed or structurally foreclosed. The animal in us is not merely the object of a pre-conscious investment determined by interest, but the object of a libidinal investment of desire that only secondarily derives an image of the father from desiring production. The same holds true for the libidinal investment of food, wherever a fear of going hungry is evident, or a pleasure at not being hungry, and this investment refers only secondarily to an image of the mother. We have already seen how the prohibition of incest referred not to Oedipus, but to the non-coded flows that constitute desire, and to their representative, the intense pre-personal flow. As for Oedipus, it is another way of coding the uncodable, of codifying what eludes the codes, or of displacing desire and its object, a way of entrapping them. Culturalists and ethnologists have demonstrated that institutions are primary in relation to affects and structures. For structures are not mental, they are present in things. Elles sont dans les choses, in the forms of social production and reproduction. Even an author like Marcuse, whom one would not suspect of complacence in this regard, acknowledges that culturalism started on the right track, introducing desire into production, strengthening the link between instinctual and economic structure, and at the same time indicating the possibility of progress beyond the patricentric acquisitive culture. Then what caused culturalism to go wrong? And here again, there is no contradiction in the fact that it started on the right track and that it went wrong from the start. Perhaps the answer lies in the postulate common to Oedipal relativism and Oedipal absolutism, i.e. the stubborn maintenance of a familialist perspective which wreaks havoc everywhere. For if the institution is first understood as a familial institution, it matters little to say that the familial complex varies with the institutions, or that Oedipus is, to the contrary, a nuclear constant around which families and institutions turn. The culturalists invoke other triangles, maternal uncle, aunt, nephew, for example. But the Oedipalists have no difficulty in demonstrating that these are imaginary variations of one and the same structural constant, different figures of one and the same symbolic triangulation, which are not identical either with the personages who come to realize the triangulation or with the attitudes that come to place these personages in relation to each other. But inversely, the invocation of such a transcendent symbolism does not rescue the structuralists from the narrowest familial point of view. The same holds for the endless debates on, is it daddy, is it mummy? You are neglecting the mother, No, you're the one who fails to see the father off to the side, as the empty position. The conflict between culturalists and orthodox psychoanalysts has often been reduced to these evaluations of the respective roles of the mother and the father, or of the pre-Oedipal and the Oedipal, without allowing either side to leave the family, or even Oedipus, always oscillating between the two famous poles, the pre-Oedipal maternal pole of the imaginary and the Oedipal paternal pole of the structural, both on the same axis, both speaking the same language of a familialized social realm, where one pole designates the customary maternal dialects, while the other designates the imperative law of the language of the father. The ambiguity of what Kardiner calls the primary institution has been clearly shown. In certain cases, it can be a question of the way desire invests the social field from childhood, and under the familial stimuli coming from the adult. All the conditions would then be given for an adequate, extra-familial understanding of the libido. But more often, it is solely a question of the familial organization in itself, which is thought to be lived first by the child as a microcosm, then projected into the adult and social development. Devenir. From this point of view, the discussion can only go round in circles between the holders of a cultural interpretation and the holders of a symbolic or structural interpretation of this same organization. A second postulate common to the culturalists and the symbolists should be added. They all agree that, in our patriarchal and capitalist society at least, Oedipus is a sure thing, even if they underline, as does Fromm, the elements of a new matriarchy. They all agree that our society is the stronghold of Oedipus, the starting point for re-encountering an Oedipal structure everywhere, or on the contrary, they hold that the terms and the relations should be made to vary within non-Oedipal complexes that are no less familial on that account. That is why our preceding criticism was directed at Oedipus, as it is meant to command our respect and to function for us. It is not at the weakest point, the primitives, that Oedipus must be attacked, but at the strongest point, at the level of the strongest link, by revealing the degree of disfiguration it implies and brings to bear on desiring production, on the syntheses of the unconscious, and on libidinal investments in our cultural and social milieu. Not that Oedipus counts for nothing in our society. We have said repeatedly that Oedipus is demanded, and demanded again and again. And even an attempt as profound as Lacan's at shaking loose from the yoke of Oedipus has been interpreted as an unhoped-for means of making it heavier still, and of resecuring it on the baby and the schizo. To be sure, it is not only legitimate but indispensable that the ethnological or historical explanation not be in contradiction with our social organization, or that this organization contain in its own way the basic elements of the ethnological hypothesis. This is what Marx was saying as he recalled the requirements of a universal history, but, as he went on to say, provided that the current organization be capable of conducting its own criticism. And yet Oedipus's autocritique is something rarely seen in our organization, of which psychoanalysis forms a part. In certain respects, it is correct to question all social formations starting from Oedipus, but not because Oedipus might be a truth of the unconscious that is especially visible where we are concerned. On the contrary, because it is a mystification of the unconscious that has only succeeded with us by assembling the parts and wheels of its apparatus from elements of the previous social formations. It is universal in that sense. Thus, it is indeed within capitalist society that the critique of Oedipus must always resume its point of departure and find again its point of arrival. Oedipus is a limit. But limit has many different meanings, since it can be at the beginning as an inaugural event in the role of a matrix, or in the middle as a structural function ensuring the mediation of personages and the ground of their relations, or at the end as an eschatological determination. Now we have seen that it is only in this last sense that Oedipus is a limit. This is also the case for desiring production. But in fact, this last sense itself can be understood in many different ways. In the first place, desiring production is situated at the limits of social production. The decoded flows at the limits of the codes and the territorialities. The body without organs at the limits of the socius. We shall speak of an absolute limit every time the schizoflows pass through the wall, scramble all the codes, and deterritorialize the socius. The body without organs is the deterritorialized socius, the wilderness where the decoded flows run free, the end of the world, the apocalypse. Secondly, however, the relative limit is no more nor less than the capitalist social formation, because the latter engineers, machine, and mobilizes flows that are effectively decoded, but does so by substituting for the codes a quantifying axiomatic, une axiomatique comptable, that is even more oppressive. With the result that capitalism, in conformity with the movement by which it counteracts its own tendency, is continually drawing near the wall, while at the same time pushing the wall further away. Schizophrenia is the absolute limit, but capitalism is the relative limit. Thirdly, there is no social formation that does not foresee or experience a foreboding of the real form in which the limit threatens to arrive, and which it wards off with all the strength it can command. Whence the obstinacy with which the formations preceding capitalism encast the merchant and the technician, preventing flows of money and flows of production from assuming an autonomy that would destroy their codes. Such is the real limit. When such societies are confronted with this real limit, repressed from within, but which returns to them from without, they regard this event with melancholy as the sign of their approaching death. For example, the Bohannans describe the Tiv economy, which codes three kinds of flows: consumer goods, prestige goods, and women and children. When money supervenes, it can only be coded as an object of prestige, yet merchants use it to lay hold of sectors of consumer goods traditionally held by the women. All the codes vacillate. Doubtless, to begin with money and to finish with money is an operation that cannot be expressed in terms of a code. Seeing the trucks that leave loaded with export goods, the Tiv elders deplore this situation and know what is happening, but do not know where to place their blame. A harsh reality. But, fourthly, this limit inhibited from the interior was already projected onto a primordial beginning, a mythical matrix as the imaginary limit. How can this nightmare be imagined? The invasion of the socius by non-coded flows that move like lava. An irrepressible wave of shit, as in the Fourbe myth, or the intense germinal influx. The this side of incest, as in the Urugu myth, which introduces disorder into the world by acting as the representative of desire. Whence, in the fifth and last instance, the importance of the task of displacing the limit, causing it to pass into the interior of the socius, in the middle, between a beyond of alliance, and a filiative this side of, between a representation of alliance and the representation of filiation, as one attempts to tame the dreaded forces of a river by digging an artificial river bed, or by diverting it into 1,000 shallow little streams. Oedipus is this displaced limit. Yes, Oedipus is universal, but the error lies in having believed in the following alternative. Either Oedipus is the product of the social psychic repression system, in which case it is not universal, or it is universal, and a position of desire. In reality, it is universal because it is the displacement of the limit that haunts all societies, the displaced represented, le représente déplace, that disfigures what all societies dread absolutely as their most profound negative, namely the decoded flows of desire. This is not to say that the universal Oedipal limit is occupied, strategically occupied in all social formations. We must take Kardiner's remarks seriously. A Hindu or an Eskimo can dream of Oedipus without, however, being subjected to the complex, without having the complex. For Oedipus to be occupied, a certain number of conditions are indispensable. The field of social production and reproduction must become independent of familial reproduction. That is, independent of the territorial machine that declines alliances and filiations. The detachable fragments of the chain must be converted, by virtue of this independence, into a transcendent detached object that crushes their polyvocal character. The detached object, phallus, must perform a kind of folding operation, a kind of application or reduction, rabattement, a reduction of the social field, defined as the aggregate of departure, to the familial field, now defined as the aggregate of destination. And it must establish a network of one-to-one relations between the two. For Oedipus to be occupied, it is not enough that it be a limit or a displaced represented in the system of representation. It must migrate to the heart of the system and itself come to occupy the position of the representative of desire. These conditions, inseparable from the paralogisms of the unconscious, are realized in the capitalist formation. Furthermore, they imply certain archaisms borrowed from the imperial barbarian formations, in particular, the position of the transcendent object. The capitalist style has been described by D.H. Lawrence. Our democratic industrial order of things, whose style is, "My dear little lamb, I went to see mummy." Now, on the one hand, it is evident that the primitive formations do not come close to fulfilling these conditions, precisely because the family, when open to alliances, is coextensive with and adequate to the social historical field, because it animates social reproduction itself, because it mobilizes or causes passage of the detachable fragments without ever converting them into a detached object. No reduction whatever, no application is possible that would answer to the formula 3 plus 1, the four corners of the field folded into three, like a tablecloth, plus the transcendent term that performs the folding operation. Speaking, dancing, exchanging, and allowing to flow, and even urinating, in the midst of the community of men, as Parin himself puts it, to express the fluidity of the flows and the primitive codes. At the heart of primitive production, one always finds oneself at 4 plus n, in the system of ancestors and affines. Far from being able to claim that here there is no end to Oedipus, one sees that it never manages to begin. One is always brought to a halt well before 3 plus 1, and if there is a primitive Oedipus, it is a neg Oedipus, in the sense of a neg entropy. Oedipus is indeed a displaced represented, but precisely in such a way that each member of the group is always on this side of or beyond, without ever occupying the position. Kardiner has understood this very well in the formula we cited. It is colonization that causes Oedipus to exist, but an Oedipus that is taken for what it is, a pure oppression, inasmuch as it assumes that these savages are deprived of the control over their own social production, that they are ripe for being reduced to the only thing they have left, the familial reproduction imposed on them, being no less Oedipalized by force than it is alcoholic or sickly. On the other hand, when the requisite conditions are realized in capitalist society, it should not be thought on that account that Oedipus ceases to be what it is, the simple displaced represented that comes to usurp the place of the representative of desire, snaring the unconscious in the trap of its paralogisms, crushing the whole of desiring production, replacing it with a system of beliefs. Oedipus is never a cause. It depends on a previous social investment of a certain type, capable of falling back on, se rabattre sur, family determinations. It will be objected that such a principle is perhaps valid for the adult, but surely not for the child. But in effect, Oedipus begins in the mind of the father, and the beginning is not absolute. It is only constituted starting from investments of the social historical field that are affected by the father. And if it passes over to the son, this is not by virtue of a familial heredity, but by virtue of a much more complex relationship that depends on the communication of the unconsciouses, with the result that, even in the child, what is invested through the familial stimuli is still the social field, and a whole system of breaks and extra-familial flows. The fact that the father is first in relation to the child can only be understood analytically in terms of another primacy, that of social investments and counter-investments in relation to familial investments. This will be seen later at the level of an analysis of deliriums. But already, if it appears that Oedipus is an effect, this is because it forms an aggregate of destination. The family become microcosm, on which capitalist production and reproduction fall back. The organs and the agents of the latter no longer pass through a coding of flows of alliance and filiation, but through an axiomatic of decoded flows. Consequently, the capitalist formation of sovereignty will need an intimate colonial formation that corresponds to which it will be applied, and without which it would have no hold on the productions of the unconscious. Given these conditions, what is there to say about the relationship between ethnology and psychoanalysis? Must we be content with an uncertain parallelism where each contemplates the other with perplexity, placing in opposition two irreducible sectors of symbolism? A social sector of symbols and a sexual sector that would constitute a kind of private universal, a kind of individual universal. Transversals between the two, since social symbolism can become a sexual material, and sexuality a ritual of social aggregation. But the problem is too theoretical when posed this way. Practically speaking, the psychoanalyst often claims to explain to the ethnologist the meaning of the symbol. It means phallus, castration, Oedipus. But the ethnologist asks other questions, and sincerely asks himself, of what use can psychoanalytic interpretations be to me? Hence the duality is displaced. It is no longer between two sectors, but between two kinds of questions. What does it mean, and what purpose does it serve? Of what use is it not only to the ethnologist, but what purpose does it serve, and how does it work in the very formation that makes use of the symbol? Whatever may be the meaning of a thing, it is not certain that the thing serves any useful purpose whatever. It is possible, for example, that Oedipus serves no useful purpose either for psychoanalysts or for the unconscious. And to what use could the phallus be put, since it is inseparable from the castration that deprives us of its use? Of course, we are told not to confuse the signified with the signifier. But does the signifier take us beyond the question, what does it mean? Is it anything other than this same question, only this time barred? This is still the domain of representation. The true misunderstandings, the misunderstandings between ethnologists, or Hellenists, and psychoanalysts, do not come from a faulty knowledge or recognition of the unconscious, of sexuality, of the phallic nature of symbolism. In theory, everyone could reach an agreement on this point. Everything is sexual or sex-influenced, sexu, from one end to the other. Everyone knows this, beginning with the users. The practical misunderstandings come rather from the profound difference between the two sorts of questions. Without always formulating it clearly, the ethnologists and the Hellenists think that a symbol is not defined by what it means, but by what it does, and by what is done with it. It always means the phallus, or something similar, except that what it means does not tell what purpose it serves. In a word, there is no ethnological interpretation, for the simple reason that there is no ethnographic material. There are only uses and functionings, des fonctionnements. On this point, it could be that psychoanalysts have much to learn from ethnologists about the unimportance of what does it mean. When Hellenists place themselves in opposition to the Freudian Oedipus, it should not be thought that they put forward other interpretations to replace the psychoanalytic interpretation. It could be that ethnologists and Hellenists will compel psychoanalysts, for their part, to make a similar discovery, namely, that there is no unconscious material either, nor is there a psychoanalytic interpretation, but only uses, analytic uses of the syntheses of the unconscious, which do not allow themselves to be defined by an assignment of a signifier any more than by the determination of signifieds. How it works is the sole question. Schizoanalysis forgoes all interpretation because it forgoes discovering an unconscious material. The unconscious does not mean anything. On the other hand, the unconscious constructs machines, which are machines of desire, whose use and functioning schizoanalysis discovers in their immanent relationship with social machines. The unconscious does not speak, it engineers. It is not expressive or representative, but productive. A symbol is nothing other than a social machine that functions as a desiring machine. a desiring machine that functions within the social machine, an investment of the social machine by desire. It has often been said and demonstrated that an institution cannot be explained by its use any more than an organ can. Biological formations and social formations are not formed in the same way in which they function, nor is there a biological, sociological, linguistic, etc. functionalism at the level of large determinate aggregates, des grands ensembles spécifiques. But the same does not hold true in the case of desiring machines as molecular elements. There, use, functioning, production, and formation are one and the same process. And it is this synthesis of desire that, under certain determinate conditions, explains the molar aggregates, les ensembles molaires, with their specific use in a biological, social, or linguistic field. This is because the large molar machines presuppose pre-established connections that are not explained by their functioning, since the latter results from them. Only desiring machines produce connections according to which they function, and function by improvising and forming the connections. A molar functionalism is therefore a functionalism that did not go far enough, that did not reach those regions where desire engineers, independently of the macroscopic nature of what it is engineering. Organic, social, linguistic, etc. elements, all tossed into the same pot to stew. The only unities, multiplicities that functionalism must know are the desiring machines themselves, and the configurations they form in all the sectors of a field of production. The total fact. A magical chain brings together plant life, pieces of organs, a shred of clothing, an image of daddy, formulas and words. We shall not ask what it means, but what kind of machine is assembled in this manner? What kind of flows and breaks in the flows, in relation to other breaks and other flows? Analyzing the symbolism of the forked branch among the Ndembu, Victor Turner shows that the names given to them form a part of a chain that mobilizes the species and the properties of the trees from which the branches are taken, as well as the names of these species in turn, and the technical procedures with which they are treated. Selections are made from signifying chains no less than from material flows. The exegetical meaning, what is said about the thing, is only one element among others, and is less important than the operative use, what is done with the thing, or the positional functioning, the relationship with other things in one and the same complex, according to which the symbol is never in a one-to-one relationship with what it means, but always has a multiplicity of reference, being always multivocal and polysemous. Analyzing the magical object buti among the Kukuya of the Congo, Pierre Bonaf shows how it is inseparable from the practical syntheses that produce, record, and consume it. The partial and non-specific connection that combines fragments from the body of the subject with those of an animal. The inclusive disjunction that inscribes the object in the body of the subject and transforms the latter into a man-animal. The residual conjunction that causes the residue to submit to a long voyage before burying or immersing it. If present-day ethnologists are again evincing a lively interest in the hypothetical concept of the fetish, this is unquestionably due to the influence of psychoanalysis. But it would seem that psychoanalysis offers them just as many reasons for doubting the notion as it offers for attracting their interest. For psychoanalysis has never said phallus Oedipus castration more often than apropos of the fetish. While, for his part, the ethnologist senses that there is a problem of political power and economic and religious force, inseparable from the fetish, even when its use is individual and private. Hair, for example, the rituals of haircutting and coiffure. Is there any interest in referring these rituals to the phallus entity as signifying the separate thing, and in everywhere re-encountering the father as the symbolic representative of the separation? Wouldn't this be tantamount to remaining at the level of what it means? The ethnologist finds himself before a flow of hair, with the breaks in such a flow, and with what passes from one state into another through the break. As Leach says, hair as a partial object or as a separable part of the body does not represent an aggressive and separate phallus. Hair is a thing in its own right, a material part in an aggressing apparatus, in a separating machine. Once again, it is not a question of knowing if the essence of a ritual is sexual or if it is necessary to take into account political, economic, and religious dimensions that would go beyond sexuality. So long as the problem is put in this manner, so long as a choice is imposed between libido and noumen, the misunderstanding between ethnologists and psychoanalysts can only be aggravated, just as it continues to grow between Hellenists and psychoanalysts apropos of Oedipus. Oedipus, the club-footed despot, who clearly invokes an entire political history that brings into conflict the despotic machine and the old primitive territorial machine, whence derive both the negation and the persistence of autochthony, brought into clear relief by Lévi-Strauss. But this is not enough to desexualize the drama. On the contrary, in reality it is a question of knowing how one conceives of sexuality and libidinal investment. Must they be referred to an event, or to something that is felt, which remains familial and intimate in spite of everything? An intimate Oedipal feeling, even when it is interpreted structurally, on behalf of the pure signifier? Or rather, is it necessary to open sexuality and libidinal investment onto the determinations of a socio-historical field, where the economic, the political, and the religious are things that are invested by the libido for themselves, and not the derivatives of a daddy mummy? In the first instance, one studies large molar aggregates, large social machines, the economic, the political, etc. And this entails searching for what they mean by applying them to an abstract familial whole that is thought to contain the secret of the libido. In this way, one remains in the framework of representation. In the second instance, one goes beyond these large aggregates, including the family, toward the molecular elements that form the parts and wheels of desiring machines. One searches for the way in which these machines function, for how they invest and underdetermine, subdeterminant, the social machines that they constitute on a large scale. One then reaches the regions of a productive, molecular, micrological, or microphysical unconscious that no longer means or represents anything. Sexuality is no longer regarded as a specific energy that unites persons derived from the large aggregates, but as the molecular energy that places molecules, partial objects, libido, in connection, that organizes inclusive disjunctions on the giant molecule of the body without organs, noumen, and that distributes states of being and becoming according to domains of presence or zones of intensity, voluptas. For desiring machines are precisely that, the microphysics of the unconscious, the elements of the micro-unconscious. But as such, they never exist independently of the historical molar aggregates, of the macroscopic social formations that they constitute statistically. In this sense, there is only desire and the social. Beneath the conscious investments of economic, political, religious, etc. formations, there are unconscious sexual investments, micro-investments that attest to the way in which desire is present in a social field, and joins this field to itself as the statistically determined domain that is bound to it. Desiring machines function within social machines, as though they maintain their own regime in the molar aggregates that they form at the level of large numbers. Symbols and fetishes are manifestations of desiring machines. Sexuality is by no means a molar determination that is representable in a familial whole. It is the molecular underdetermination functioning within social and secondarily familial aggregates that trace desire's field of presence and its field of production. An entire non-Oedipal unconscious that will only produce Oedipus as one of its secondary statistical formations, complexes, at the end of a history bringing into play the destiny of social machines, their regime compared to that of desiring machines.